Well, if you've still stuck it out with the course up to here, rather than having tossed it in the fire or into your sock drawer, angrily demanding a refund, if everything has worked right, we would have gotten you to a certain point right now, thanks to research on the part of the big R&D division of the teaching company. What we would have accomplished by now is you should be feeling depressed as hell. And this is 22 lectures or so into this, and there has been nothing but bad news so far. At this point, it should seem just like miraculous that you're still functioning. I mean, look at all these ways that your body can go wrong. Actually, don't look at it. Let's hold on for one more stress-related disease, and this is as much stress trivia for today as you can get. Remember, okay, see who was actually listening. Remember that disease a number of lectures ago of hair falling out. The version where you don't know why it happened, idiopathic alopecia areata, it turns out there's a stress-related version of alopecia areata where you are so traumatized by something or other happening that over the next few days your hair turns white and falls out. This is for real. This is a real disease. This is like a once-in-a-career of a physician's disease, but this is a real one. Look at this. So you're chronically stressed, you get high blood pressure, you get diabetes, you stop growing, you become flatulent, your sex life's ruined, your brain gets damaged, and your hair falls out. How is it any of us are still functioning? How have we not all just collapsed into puddles of stress-related disease? And what's clear is, for the most part, we haven't collapsed into those puddles. We're kind of muddling along. We're scraping along. We're coping. We're coping, and that's the critical point in this last part of the course. What does stress management consist of? What does coping consist of? And what's clear from day one all the way back to Selye in the 1930s, all the way back to the very first rats that were being experimentally exposed to generalized unpleasantries, what was clear from the very start was variability, individual differences, translated into sort of our vocabulary for these couple of lectures, that from the very start of thinking about stress and coping, it's clear that some individuals deal with stress much better than others. Some cope better. And thus, in beginning to think about how to incorporate some wisdom into one's stress management techniques, inevitably where you need to start is asking, what's up with those individuals who cope better? What does it have to do? Why do some bodies, and even more importantly, some psyches, deal better with stress than others? What are the mechanisms underlying individual differences, enhanced resistance to stress-related disease? And once that's under your belt and you know exactly how that works, how can you sign up and wind up being more like those folks who just happen to be good at that? Because that's where we're going to start. Rather than prescriptions, and rather even than going over the science of experimental manipulations to make individuals better at dealing with stress, let's start off just seeing some of the wild success stories out there of individuals, individual organisms in some case, who just happen to be the ones who are spectacular at dealing with stress. Okay, first domain. First domain was promised towards the end of that lecture on aging, which was one of the great ones for nothing but bad news, promising at the very end that, in fact, there's some good news lurking there, and good news being what is now called successful aging. And this is one of those scenarios you go to a gerontology conference and somebody gets up and they study this organ system, and what their talk is about is how it falls apart during aging, and the next person gets up and they study this other organ and how it falls apart during aging. And it's all really like quite cheerful, but you look closely at the data and you do some math over some of the figures that you're being shown, and what always pops out is there's always a subset of those individual subjects, those individual rats and fruit flies and college graduates and all of that. There's always a subset where things aren't getting worse with aging. And in fact, some of the time these measures are even getting better. And this weird statistical sort of observation is now this whole subfield of successful aging. So what goes into successful aging? Some of the time, as we'll see, it's some pretty logical sorts of things. Some of the time, rather unexpected. First version, What is a version of rat unsuccessful aging? Well, we've heard plenty of this by now. We've heard about how during aging in rats, basal resting levels of glucocorticoids begin to rise, about how the hippocampus doesn't work as well, increasing amounts of damage, there are memory problems. And in fact, work that came out in the 1980s, some of it my own, showing that in fact there's a connection between the two. We know one of the pieces of that already, rise in glucocorticoids in the aging rat, causing accelerated aging in the hippocampus. For insanely complicated reasons we're not going anywhere near, a more and more damaged hippocampus leads to higher and higher glucocorticoid levels. Yet again, another vicious circle there. And this seemed to be the case until you suddenly realize that's not, in fact, an inevitable feature of aging. There's some rats who don't show this pattern. Which rats are they? We've already heard about them. The rats who way back when had the moms who licked them more and groomed them more, mothering style, playing out in old age. So here we see one pathway towards rat successful aging. And we already see one domain in which this is not going to turn into an obvious prescription for how we go about our mothering styles. Okay, well, what are other cases where you see successful aging? One of the classic ones, seeing what some of the predictors were, is this famed Harvard aging study, which was a bunch of Harvard-associated psychiatrists back in the 1940s, took the graduating class of 1941, took a random subset of these men, yes, it was all men back then, and did this grand prospective longitudinal study intensively following these men over the decades since. One of the key issues being, what are the old ages of these men going to be like, and what sort of predictors along the way will there be as to who have the healthiest old ages and the longest years? And out of it come all sorts of interesting findings. Some of them aren't so interesting. What was one of the big predictors? Having a healthy lifestyle. Smoke, and your life expectancy is going to be shorter, even if you're a 1941 Harvard graduate, be overweight, don't get enough exercise, drink too much, all of that. Okay, this makes perfect sense. Next thing that came through in this grand study, have yourself a long-lasting, stable, good marriage, and that's just greatly increased the odds of a hale and hearty old age. Okay, that sure makes sense from everything we heard about social connectiveness and social support, but there may be little things creeping in the back way. For example, having someone who you live with in your later years, you've got somebody who, in addition to all the heartwarming support, you got somebody to remind you to take your medicine. These are the sort of confounds that go into that literature. What other factors? Something else that won't be at all surprising given the previous lectures. Avoid major clinical depression throughout adulthood, and that's a predictor for a longer lifespan and a healthier, more successful old age. And that sure makes sense to us by now, and especially given a finding that's emerged in recent years, major clinical depression, everything else being equal, you've increased the risk of heart disease. A connection there, often years and years between the two events, another price that you pay. So, try to not be depressed. Oh, great, really useful advice here. Even more so, try not to be neurotic. That's another marker of unsuccessful aging among these Harvard grads. What else? Have a resilient personality, and we will see in more detail what the building blocks of that are, and have an extroverted personality. And that's a good thing, in part because extroversion tends to go hand in hand with decreased risk of depression, decreased risk of neurosis. Okay, so you've got this whole package deal. That's wonderful. That's very informative. This doesn't do me much good. Number one, I was not 20 in 1941. Number two, I was not some good solid fellow Harvard graduate from back when. I'm not even male. I don't have the option to not be depressed or to be unneurotic. There's only so much you can do with findings like these. But there's limits also. What else winds up being a predictor of successful old age? And this one makes a whole ton of sense the older you get: respect. One of the predictors is if you are in a position in your life, your personal life, your occupational life, whatever, where as you get older, you are subject to, if anything, increasing respect. Wow, is that a predictor of a healthy old age? What are we describing here? We're describing becoming a village elder. And that's a very rare thing in our society because we've got some awfully bizarre, screwed up feelings about the aging process. You're young, and all you want to do is be older, be old enough to do this, old enough to learn about that, whatever. And then once you hit this magical stage, and I'm guessing, I don't know, it's somewhere around 30 or so, there's this horribly neurotic transition, and suddenly you want to be mistaken for somebody younger. Suddenly you want to act younger. Suddenly the greatest compliment in the world is for somebody to say, you're 33? My God, I would have guessed you were 31. Oh, why, thank you. Suddenly we have this whole different attitude towards aging. We've got a very weird view of aging. Sit down someone from a traditional African village and say to them at age 50, wow, you look like you're 30 and you've just insulted them. They would much rather look like 70 because that's the time of life where you are most honored, most respected, most powerful. So that's something that's often lacking from our society. And when you see when it does occur, there's some very interesting consequences. Two of the longest living associated professions out there have very distinctive features that go along with these professions. One we've heard about already, orchestral conductors. Part of what's good for them is all that aerobic stuff we heard about. But a big chunk of what's good for them is the control, the respect, the authority, the autonomy. My God, you could be a 90-year-old conductor and you're still determining when all these other adults go to the bathroom, as we heard about. So that's one occupation that predicts a very successful old age. What's the other one? The closest thing our society has to a village elder, being a Supreme Court justice. Tremendous longevity and function and quality and successful old aging in those folks. And it makes perfect sense. This is like the world's greatest job. You don't work that much of the year. You only pick the cases that are interesting. All the scut work is done for you by these hyperactive, manic law clerks. And then you decide things that change the course of history. No wonder these guys do wonderfully. It's our equivalent of a village elder. So these are some of the things that predict successful aging. What are other markers that go along with the rats, the primates, the humans, who simply deal with stress better than others? Now we move into an extremely interesting, extremely informative, potentially extremely moving literature having to do with people who have children who have serious, severe illnesses. As most studied, parents of children with cancer. And these folks have been studied in lots of settings, but this is one classic study. Took a population of parents, children with cancer, children with serious cancer, and what they looked at were the indices in these parents of stress-related pathogens. What were their glucocorticoid levels like, blood pressure, cholesterol levels, all the sorts of things. And looking, there would be, as per usual, tremendous variability, a whole spread as to some of the parents who were doing horribly in terms of those measures, some who were doing relatively good, independent of how serious the child's cancer was. All of these were cases of serious cancer. So in this classic study, they tried to figure out, well, what are the predictors of the parents who were doing better physiologically in the face of a disaster like this? And this fascinating set of studies where not only are there the medical measurements in these folks, but intensive interviews, psychotherapeutic interviews with these parents, trying to see what's different. There were a few markers that came out, a few key differences. The first one was, what do you do with some of the anxiety, some of the fears intrinsic in this whole cancer process? Here would be a typical scenario. Like virtually any parent in this position, they are there around the clock. This is just consuming them. They're exhausted. At some point, friends or family convince them, you need to go away for a weekend. You need to do something. You're falling apart here. They're finally convinced. Along comes Friday night. They're about to go away for this weekend, and the psychologist working on the project asks them, well, how do you feel about this? And two different categories. There's the first group that says, my God, I know this disease. I know this disease. I've seen children on the ward. It could come in from out of nowhere. It could take them in a few days. My God, what if I'm away and my child dies? Other version, they sit there and say, well, you know, it's probably a good thing I'm getting away, but I'm kind of worried. I'm worried because I'm worried they're not going to pay enough attention to him. Or, you know, the nurses are busy. Maybe one of them will have time to read a book to him. They're not going to read it like I do. I'm afraid it's not going to be as good for him. If you can take oh my God, what if he dies while I'm away? And turn it into, oh my God, what if the nurses don't read Goodnight Moon as effectively as I do? The ones who could break down these huge worries into these smaller pieces, much better physiological profiles, lower glucocorticoid levels. Next predictor. This was a period when the kids would go into remission, cancer remission, where there was an issue of, are they cured? Is it going to come back? When is it going to come back? So now the psychologists sit down the parents and say, well, how do you feel about this period of remission? And there's the ones who would say, remission, remission. Don't even say that word. Remission, it isn't. He's cured. She's going to live forever. It's fine now. I don't even want to hear that word. And then there's the ones who would say, well, we're enormously grateful for this period, but, the statistics are not great, and, every day is going to be a blessing, but we have to be realistic about it. Parents who sit there and are realistic about it have much higher glucocorticoid levels than ones who say, over with, done, we don't have to think about it anymore. What does that hark back to? Those psychological control issues there of, do you always want to have a sense of control, not in the face of horrific stressors. In cases like that, denial might be a very good thing. And here's one of these domains where denial, in fact, was quite protective. Stay tuned, bad news about that nonetheless to come. One additional variable that they found, which was, did these parents have a religious framework for explaining where the cancer had come from? What do I mean by that? On one hand, you have the parents sitting there saying, this is the worst thing conceivable, and this is the biggest challenge of our lives, but, we're religious people, and sometimes at the worst moments, I think, God has chosen us for this task. God knows that we can carry this burden. And this is going to sound crazy, but it almost feels good knowing that God knew that we could carry this, versus the ones who would sit there and say, God, don't tell me about God in mysterious ways. I don't even want to hear about God this decade or so. If you could look at your child declining with cancer and think that this was a sign that God knew you can carry a burden, much lower glucocorticoid levels. So the starts of some insight here, but again, foreshadowing, these particular studies are going to come back to haunt us big time. What else? Studying baboons, my baboons in fact, and looking at this world of terrible male-male competition where we've already seen if you're a low-ranking male, you have elevated glucocorticoid levels. Wait, not so fast. It was more complicated than that. If you're a low-ranking male and the hierarchy is stable and the alpha male is psychologically adept, then you have, okay, all those qualifications. But what we also saw was there's another issue lurking in the background there, which is personality. What's your personality like? What's your personality like if you're a baboon? First, do you even have personality? Yes, indeed, and that's one of the hottest topics in primatology these days. The fact that non-human primates, they are smart, they're social, they're long-lived, they have personalities, they have differing temperaments, all of that. What sort of personality does it turn out work well for a baboon, a male baboon, remaining healthy in the face of this wildly competitive world? A number of predictors that begin to make sense. Number one, can you, as this male baboon, tell the difference between the threatening and the neutral things in your life? What do I mean by that? Threatening. You're sitting there, your worst rival on the whole planet shows up, threatens you in your face. This is bad news. So what do? What do? You stop whatever you're doing, and you take this very vigilant defensive stance. Contrast. You're sitting there minding your own business, and your worst rival on the planet shows up and takes a nap 100 yards away. What do you do next? What do you do next? You do exactly what you're doing. This is not a big deal. Pathetically, a large percentage of male baboons can't tell the difference between their worst rival threatening them in their face and the guy taking a nap across the field. And you can see their mindset. It's like, look at that guy. Look at that guy. Look at the way he's sleeping and the way he's snoring, and I hate it, and he's doing it just to get on my nerves. This is type A personality. This is toxic hostility, seeing challenges others don't. If you sit there and you can't tell the difference between your rival sleeping and threatening you, about twice the levels of glucocorticoids in the bloodstream. Next variable. The guy is threatening you in your face. What do you do next? Do you abdicate control and allow him to start the inevitable fight, or do you at least seize a little bit of control there? Straight out of our control predictability one, baboons who sit there and make no attempt to control the inevitable fight, about twice the glucocorticoid levels. Next variable. You've had the fight. You've had the fight, and can you tell the difference between whether the outcome was good or bad? Oh, geez, that's kind of important. And you can tell if a baboon does that by what sort of behaviors they do afterward. A baboon who can't tell the difference between winning and losing, significantly higher glucocorticoid levels. Finally, you've had the fight, and you've lost. What do you do next? Do you go and mope by yourself? Or do you go and do something social, mope by yourself, higher glucocorticoid levels? Look at this profile. Can you tell the difference between the big things and the little things? If it is a big thing, do you at least get some control over it? Can you tell if the outcome's good or bad? And if the outcome's bad, do you have some effective coping mechanisms? People pay to be taught stuff like this, and some baboons just happen to be more that way than others. Okay, so all of this is very exciting, very wonderful, very heartwarming, full of optimism. But what if you happen not to be the right sort of baboon, or not happen to have the right temperament in the face of the nightmare of cancer, or you didn't happen to have a mother who licked you the right amount back when? What can you do to, in fact, still make use of principles like this? What can you do to change? And what becomes clear is that, nonetheless, change can occur. One of the things that we find to be particularly unlikely, which is stuff can change. Athletic conditioning, people go from being out of shape into in shape. What does being athletically conditioned consist of? You lower your baseline of glucocorticoid levels and heart rate. You increase the ceiling of it. You recover faster. That happens. Certain types of individuals with type A personality who've just shown up with their first heart attack, with some very intensive work, they could change their profiles. We change. We grow, we mature, we harden, we grow together, we grow apart, we get bored, we change. It's possible for us to change. And not only is it possible, but it's hard in terms of there's no free lunch in the next lecture and a half. But nonetheless, change can occur. And where you get some of the most insights into it have been experimental studies where people have manipulated some of those psychological variables and brought about change. First version of this, extraordinary studies. You take one of the worst medical things that happens to people, which is something goes wrong, disaster, and they have a chronic pain syndrome, constantly in pain. And these are people who live for when they can get their next medication, their next painkillers. All they do is sit there in the hospital bed hitting the call button. Is it time yet? Is it time yet? It's misery for everyone involved. Some years ago, some researchers tried out something that seemed loony, where you have these powerful painkillers, and they said, no, instead of these patients driving the nurses crazy all day long, what if you gave them the medication, put it on the side of their bed on the nightstand, and whenever they needed some, they would take it? What if you allowed them to self-medicate their painkillers? Oh my God, the AMA had apoplexy. You can't do that. They'll become addicts. They're going to overdose, all of that. People tried it, and you know what? Not only don't they overdose, when chronic pain patients can self-medicate, they take less painkillers. And what does that tell you? When you are lying in bed there and it hurts and you're not sure if anybody's paying attention on the call button when they're going to come, and you need more pain medication, then it tells you two things. You're medicating the pain, but you're also medicating the lack of control. Another domain. Nursing homes, the aging process is in lots of ways. The experience of loss of control, loss of outlets, loss of autonomy, and winding up in a nursing home is one of the front lines of how that can go wrong. Wonderful studies done, led by a psychologist named Judith Rodin at Yale at the time, going into a nursing home and manipulating some of the psychological variables there. Things like you give one of these individuals a plant, and in one case, as part of the experiment, you say, oh, you need to remember to water it every day, and in the other, well, I'm going to come in and water it for you. Give the person some responsibility, some autonomy, something as trivial as that, and people's level of energy, people's level of activation get higher. Much more subtle version, and this is an extremely important classic study. Now you go into a nursing home. 3 different conditions. The first one, the control one, there's no differences in how people are living. Second one, you come in and you say, oh, we're doing this study here, and I'm wondering if this social worker student can come in every Thursday for 2 hours to talk to you about your life. Third version, oh, we're doing the study here, and I'm wondering if this social worker student can come talk to you a couple of hours a week about your life. When would be convenient? When would be convenient? Like you have a busy schedule there under these circumstances, but you know what the outcome's going to be. Socialization in interactions with a social worker, and you do better than the ones who are the controls. But have that minimal bit of input in there in terms of when would it be convenient for you, and you do significantly better. Remarkable finding. Remarkable finding that's just about to backfire on us big time. Now, if you read all of this superficially, you come out with the same potentially bad conclusion as at the end of that lecture on psychological factors with stress, which is, what's the solution? You know, slap a smiley face sticker on your forehead and just get as much control, as much predictability as possible, and it doesn't work that way. And we saw the formal versions of it in that previous lecture. You don't want to get your information too far in advance to what does that look like in the real world. First example, the kids with cancer. What did we see? The parents who could deny the possibility of cancer coming back were doing significantly better, lower glucocorticoid levels. It happened in one of these studies that the children came out of remission. The cancer came back fatally. And what happens in the aftermath? You take the parents who all along were saying, you know, this is wonderful, this is a blessing, but, you know, it may very well come back, and their indices of health, stress-related disease got a little bit worse. You take the parents who were sitting there all along saying, it's over with, it's not coming back, never have to think about it again. Back comes the cancer, and they wind up more stressed. So the denial worked only until the point that reality overwhelmed it, and then you did much worse. Another example of this, and an extremely powerful one as well, back to those nursing home studies. So what did they just do? This wonderful experiment. Okay, the social worker's coming, you know, when's convenient for you versus coming Thursday for 2 hours, all of that. And the folks who see the social workers are doing better, the social contact, throw in the element of control as well, does even better. It's great. Study's over with. 14 doctoral theses handed out. It's terrific. And you know what happens at this point, which is these participants, researchers, these social workers come in, and they say, well, you know this study's over with, so we won't be doing this anymore. Oh, I'm going to come back and visit all the time, but it's not going to be as regular anymore. And you know what happens, which is you never see him again. So what happens at that point? You have these individuals in the nursing home who, thanks to this social contact, are now doing better mood, doing better level of activity, voluntary activity, doing better, fewer doctor's visits, everything is great. End of the study, and student social workers don't come anymore. And do these individuals drop back down to where they started? No. What they did was they dropped back down to lower than where they started.